All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we've got I think a really juicy one, especially for, our listeners who are really into the more philosophical side of things.
Yeah.
We are diving into truth.
Oh, truth.
Truth, like capital T truth.
Mhm.
And as anyone who's, spent any time reading philosophy knows, it's not as simple as it seems.
No, no, no.
And our source for today is, well, it's kind of the ultimate source for this kind of thing. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And we're looking at their entry on, obviously, truth. And this thing is a beast. Like, it's huge.
Yeah.
So obviously, we're not going to cover every single detail, but what
No.
we're going to try to do is give you, like, a high-level view of kind of the current landscape of truth theory. Like, what are the big questions? What are the main theories that people are debating? How do they all fit together?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they first encounter philosophy, they think, oh, truth. That's easy. It's just, what corresponds to reality. But the more you think about it, the more you realize how many, weird edge cases there are and just how complicated it gets.
Totally. And it's one of those concepts that, like so many other things in philosophy, it kind of touches on everything else, You can't talk about truth without also talking about metaphysics and epistemology and language.
Exactly. All intertwined.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating how all those pieces kind of fit together. So where do we even begin?
Well, a good starting point might be, back in the early 20th century, a lot of the modern debate about truth starts there with what are called the neoclassical theories of truth.
Okay. Neoclassical. So like a revisit of the classic.
Yeah, exactly.
Eh.
So these theories were really trying to directly tackle the question of what is the nature of truth? And there are three main ones: the correspondence theory, the coherence theory, and pragmatist theories.
All right. So we've got three big contenders right out the gate. And it's important to keep in mind that these weren't just coming up with these ideas in isolation. They were, serious philosophers trying to integrate this understanding of truth into like their whole philosophical system, right? Like, how does this fit with their view of reality? How does it fit with their view of how we know things?
Absolutely. They were trying to build a complete picture.
Okay, so let's start with the correspondence theory. I feel like this is the one that, like, most people, kind of intuitively, that's their starting point, right?
Yeah, I think so. The basic idea is that something is true if it matches up with reality, if it corresponds to the facts.
Okay, so pretty straightforward.
On the surface, yeah. But then, like I said, there are all sorts of complexities when you really dig in.
Right. And what's interesting is our source talks about how in the early 20th century, two of the biggest names in analytic philosophy, Moore and Russell, they initially rejected the correspondence theory.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They actually, for a time, held this view called the identity theory of truth.
Okay. And how does that one work?
Well, their idea was that, a true proposition wasn't just corresponding to a fact, it was identical to a fact. Truth was just the simple, unanalyzable property that some propositions had.
So, no gap between the proposition and the fact.
Yeah.
They're just one and the same.
Exactly. But, and this is what I love about reading philosophy, they eventually changed their minds.
They did?
Yeah, they abandoned the identity theory.
Interesting. What led them to do that?
Well, they ran into problems with, false propositions. If true propositions are just identical to facts, what are false propositions?
Yeah, what are they? Are they just almost facts?
Right. And they worried that if false propositions were too much like facts, then there's no real distinction between truth and falsity, which is kind of a problem if you're a philosopher.
Yeah, that undermines the whole point.
Exactly. So they moved towards a correspondence theory, but their version was a little bit different.
Okay, so how did their correspondence theory work?
Well, they said that it wasn't propositions themselves that were true or false, but rather beliefs.
Okay, so it's our beliefs about the world that can be true or false.
Right. And a belief is true, according to their view, if and only if it corresponds to a fact.
Okay, so this is the core of the neoclassical correspondence theory, right?
Exactly. It's this ontological claim that there has to be, out there in the world, a fact that the belief corresponds to for the belief to be true.
And those facts, how do they understand those?
Well, and they saw facts as having this kind of structure. They're made up of particulars, which are individual objects and properties and relations. And some people even include universals in the mix. So it gets pretty metaphysically heavy.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how this all ties back to bigger questions about the nature of reality.
Totally. And, a lot of the debate about correspondence theory has been about this correspondence relation itself. What does it actually mean for a belief to correspond to a fact?
Yeah, that's not obvious at all.
Right. For simple beliefs, it's kind of intuitive. Like if I believe the cat is on the mat and there's a cat on a mat, then yeah, my belief corresponds to that fact.
Okay, I can see that. But what about more complicated beliefs? Like, what about general statements? All cats are mammals. Does that correspond to, like, a giant cat mammal fact?
Right. Or negative statements, there are no unicorns. Does that correspond to like the absence of a unicorn fact? It gets really tricky.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And the Stanford Encyclopedia entry goes into a lot of detail about the different ways philosophers have tried to account for this. But I think we should probably move on to the next theory just to make sure we can cover everything.
Okay, that sounds good. So next up is the coherence theory of truth. And this one's a bit of a mind bender.
It is, yeah, it's very different from the correspondence theory.
So instead of focusing on how our beliefs relate to the world, the coherence theory looks at how our beliefs relate to each other.
Okay, so it's all about internal consistency.
Exactly. The idea is that a belief is true if it fits in a coherent way with all of our other beliefs. It's
Yeah.
kind of like if you've got this big web of beliefs, a true belief is one that kind of strengthens that web, makes it more stable.
Hmm, interesting. And historically, this view has been associated with idealism, right? The
Mm.
idea that reality is ultimately mental.
Yeah, because if truth is all about how our beliefs hang together, then, it kind of suggests that our beliefs are playing a more active role in shaping what's real.
That makes sense. So it's not just that our beliefs are true because they correspond to a mind-independent world. It's more like the world is the way it is because of how our beliefs fit together.
Exactly. And that's a pretty radical idea, I think. But then that leads to the question of like, well, whose beliefs? Like, is it my individual web of beliefs that determines what's true? Or is there some kind of like collective social web of beliefs that we all kind of tap into?
Yeah, good point. And that's something that coherence theorists have struggled with.
Yeah.
Like, how do you define the system of beliefs that truth is supposed to cohere with?
Right. And one of the challenges for the coherence theory is like, how do you avoid the problem of like a really internally coherent but totally false belief system? Like, imagine someone who's like super into conspiracy theories. They might have a perfectly coherent set of beliefs, but it might all be totally detached from reality.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's one of the reasons why, even though coherence theory has a certain appeal, it hasn't been as popular as the correspondence theory.
Yeah. But I think it's important to consider these alternative views just to see like what are the different ways we can think about truth.
Absolutely. It helps us to sharpen our own understanding of the concept.
All right, so we've got correspondence theory, we've got coherence theory. What's the third one?
The third of the neoclassical theories is pragmatism. And this one, in some ways, is the most radical of the three.
Okay, so how does pragmatism view truth?
Well, it's not so much about truth being a property of beliefs or propositions. It's more about, like, what truth does. Like, what's the role of truth in our lives?
Okay, so it's a more like functional view of truth.
Exactly. And there are some really, really famous slogans associated with pragmatism. Like Pierce said, truth is the end of inquiry.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Well, for Pierce, it meant that, like, if we keep inquiring, if we keep investigating, if we keep using our best methods of reasoning and evidence gathering, we'll eventually converge on a set of beliefs that are true.
Okay, so truth is like the ultimate goal of our intellectual endeavors.
Right. And then there's another famous pragmatist slogan, truth is what works.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one.
That one's often attributed to William James, and it emphasizes the practical utility of truth. Like, a true belief is one that helps us to navigate the world effectively. It's a belief that doesn't lead us astray, that doesn't contradict our experiences.
Okay, so truth is what's useful, what's reliable in practice. And, it's interesting how these pragmatist slogans, they don't completely reject the correspondence idea.
Yeah. Pierce, for example, he actually called the correspondence theory a nominal definition of truth. Like, yeah, maybe it's technically correct, but it's not very helpful or meaningful in terms of how we actually think and act.
So they weren't saying that truth definitely doesn't correspond to reality. They were just saying that, like, focusing on that correspondence doesn't really tell us much about how truth functions in our lives.
Right. They were more interested in the practical consequences of our beliefs, in how our beliefs guide our actions and shape our experiences.
And there's also a connection between pragmatism and the coherence theory, isn't there? Like the end of inquiry that Pierce talks about, that's probably going to be a pretty coherent set of beliefs, right?
Yeah, definitely. And James's emphasis on verifiability, that also kind of lines up with the idea of coherence in the long run. Like, if a belief keeps being verified by our experiences, it's going to fit pretty well with all our other beliefs.
Okay, so pragmatism kind of has a foot in both camps in a way. It's not quite correspondence, it's not quite coherence, but it kind of draws on both of those ideas.
Right. It's a very distinct perspective on truth.
Hmm.
And I think it's one that's really resonated with a lot of people, especially outside of academic philosophy.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, so that covers the neoclassical theories, but now our source takes us in a completely different direction. Tarski's theory of truth.
Ah, Tarski. Now we're getting into some serious logic.
Yeah, Tarski's approach is very different from the neoclassical theories. He was coming from a background in mathematical logic, and he was interested in developing a rigorous, formal definition of truth.
Okay, and how did he go about doing that?
Well, first of all, he shifted the focus from beliefs and propositions to sentences. He wanted to define truth for sentences within a formal language.
So instead of asking, what is it for a belief to be true,
Mm.
he's asking, what is it for a sentence to be true?
Exactly. And he wasn't really interested in the metaphysical baggage that comes with beliefs and propositions. He wanted to stay focused on the logic of the truth predicate itself.
Okay, and how did he define truth for sentences?
Well, he came up with this famous condition called convention T, which says that any adequate definition of truth for a language has to imply what are called T biconditionals for every sentence in that language.
Okay, so what's a T biconditional?
It's a statement of the form, sentence S is true if and only if S. So, for example, the T biconditional for the sentence snow is white would be the sentence snow is white is true if and only if snow is white.
Okay, so it's like connecting the truth of the sentence to the truth of what the sentence is about.
Exactly. And Tarski thought that any good theory of truth had to satisfy this condition.
Okay, I can see why that would be a good starting point. But how do you actually go about defining truth in a way that satisfies convention T?
Well, Tarski's big insight was that you can do it recursively.
Recursively.
Yeah. So you start with the simplest sentences, the atomic sentences, and you define their truth conditions. And then you use those definitions to build up the truth conditions for more complex sentences.
So it's kind of like building a tower block by block.
Exactly. And Tarski showed how you could do this for a simple language that only had like 2 atomic sentences. Snow is white and grass is green.
Okay, I can kind of see how that would work. But how do you define truth for those atomic sentences in the first place?
Well, that's where Tarski introduced the ideas of reference and satisfaction.
Okay, and what are those?
Reference is the relation between a word and the thing it refers to. So the word snow refers to snow.
Okay, good.
And satisfaction is the relation between a predicate and the things it applies to. So the predicate is white is satisfied by things that are white.
Okay, I'm following so far.
So to define truth for the sentence, snow is white, you'd say that it's true if and only if the word snow refers to snow, and snow satisfies the predicate is white.
Okay, so it's true if the word refers to the right thing, and that thing has the property that the predicate says it has.
Exactly. And Tarski showed how you could extend this approach to handle more complex sentences, like sentences with logical connectives, and even sentences with quantifiers, like all and some.
Wow, so he really built up a whole system for defining truth.
He did, and his work has been incredibly influential not just in logic, but also in philosophy of language.
It's interesting how, like, he kind of sidestepped the whole debate about, like, correspondence versus coherence versus pragmatism. He just focused on, like, giving a rigorous definition of truth that would work for formal languages.
Yeah, yeah. But some philosophers have argued that Tarski's theory can be seen as a kind of correspondence theory in disguise.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The idea is that, like, reference and satisfaction, those are basically relations between language and the world. So if you define truth in terms of reference and satisfaction, you're implicitly saying that truth is about how language hooks onto reality.
I can kind of see that. But I guess it depends on how you interpret those relations of reference and satisfaction.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky, because Tarski himself wasn't very explicit about the metaphysics of reference and satisfaction.
So it's kind of up for grabs how we interpret his theory.
Right. And that's why there's been so much debate about whether Tarski's theory is really a correspondence theory or not.
I guess it makes sense that there's still room for interpretation even in such a rigorous formal theory.
Yeah. And, some philosophers have tried to, like, fill in the gaps in Tarski's theory. They've tried to give more substantive accounts of reference and satisfaction, accounts that would explicitly connect them to a correspondence view of truth.
Okay, so like building on Tarski's foundation, but adding in that correspondence element.
Exactly. And one of the most influential attempts to do this is Hartree Field's work.
Oh, Field. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's a big name in philosophy of language.
Yeah. And Field argues that we need to supplement Tarski's theory with like a causal theory of reference. So the idea is that the word snow refers to snow because there's this causal chain that connects the word to the stuff.
Okay, so it's not just a matter of like stipulation or definition.
Mhm.
There's this real world connection between the word and the thing.
Exactly. And if you build that into Tarski's theory, then you've got a pretty strong argument for a correspondence theory of truth.
That's really interesting. So it's like taking the rigor of Tarski's formal approach and combining it with the intuitive appeal of the correspondence idea.
Right. And this kind of approach also connects to the broader idea of representation.
Okay, representation. So like how our thoughts and language represent the world.
Exactly. If you think that the meaning of a word or a sentence comes from its representing something in the world, then it makes sense to say that truth is about whether that representation is accurate.
Yeah, I could see that. If our thoughts and language are kind of like maps of reality, then truth is about whether those maps match up with the terrain.
Right. And that's the basic idea behind a lot of contemporary correspondence theories.
But even with these more sophisticated accounts, there's still the issue of like, what are the things that our language is representing? Like, are they facts?
Yeah, that's the big question. And
Right.
some philosophers are perfectly happy to say, yes, we need facts.
Okay, so back to fact.
Back to facts. And they argue that, like, Tarski's theory, even with all the additions, it's not enough. We need a metaphysics that includes facts as basic entities.
Okay. And what are some of the arguments for that?
Well, one of the most famous arguments is the truth maker argument.
Oh, the truth maker argument.
Yeah, the basic idea is that, like, every truth has to be made true by something. There has to be something in the world that makes it the case that the sentence is true.
Okay, so every truth needs a truth maker.
Exactly. And the truth maker theorists argue that, like, the best candidates for truth makers are facts.
So, like, the fact that the cat is on the mat is what makes the sentence, the cat is on the mat, true.
Right. And there are different versions of truth maker theory. Some are more formal, some are more metaphysical, but they all share this commitment to the idea that truth is grounded in facts.
Okay. But I remember you mentioning earlier that, like, truth maker theory has some trouble with negative truths.
Yeah, it does. Like, if it's true that the cat is not on the mat, what's the truth maker for that? Is there a negative fact, a fact of the cat's not being on the mat?
Hmm, that's a tough one.
Yeah, and that's just one of the challenges that truth maker theory faces. But I think it's a really interesting and important approach because it really forces us to think about the relationship between truth and metaphysics.
Absolutely. It highlights how our theory of truth is going to have implications for our whole understanding of reality.
Right. And this brings us to the whole debate about realism and anti-realism. Because, how you think about truth is going to affect how you think about whether there's a mind-independent reality.
Okay, so how does realism usually line up with theories of truth?
Well, realism is basically the view that there's a world out there, independent of our minds, and that our thoughts and statements are about that world. And that fits pretty well with the correspondence theory of truth.
Yeah, because if truth is about correspondence, then it kind of presupposes that there's something out there to correspond to.
Right. And realists also tend to endorse the principle of bivalence.
Bivalence.
Yeah, it's the idea that every statement is either true or false. There's no middle ground. And realists like bivalence because it fits with their view that there's this determinate objective world that fixes the truth values of our statements.
Okay, that makes sense. So realists typically go for correspondence and bivalence.
Yeah, but it's not a perfect one-to-one mapping. Like, you can be a realist and have a different theory of truth.
Oh, right. We talked about how Moore and Russell started out as realists, but with the identity theory.
Exactly. So it's complicated. But in general, I think it's fair to say that realism tends to lean towards correspondence theories of truth.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about anti-realism? How do anti-realists approach truth?
Well, anti-realists are skeptical of the idea of a mind-independent reality, or at least they're skeptical of our ability to know anything about it. So they tend to reject bivalence.
Okay, so they think there might be statements that are neither true nor false.
Right, and they often develop alternative theories of truth, like verificationism is a classic example of an anti-realist theory of truth.
Okay, remind me how verificationism works.
Verificationism says that a statement is true if and only if it's verifiable.
Verify it.
Yeah, like if there's some way, at least in principle, to check whether it's true.
Okay, so it's all about our epistemic access to the truth.
Exactly. And that fits with the anti-realist view that, like, our knowledge is kind of limited to what we can experience and verify.
Hmm. That's interesting. So instead of truth being about correspondence to an objective world, it's
Mhm.
about our ability to, like, confirm or disconfirm the statement.
Right. And there are other anti-realist theories of truth, too. Like some people link truth to warranted assertability.
Okay, so what does that mean?
It means that a statement is true if and only if we're justified in asserting it, given the evidence we have.
So it's kind of like a social or pragmatic view of truth.
Yeah. And, it's interesting how anti-realism, even though it's rejecting this idea of a mind-independent reality, it still has to come up with a theory of truth.
Yeah, because even if you're an anti-realist, you still need a way to talk about what it means for a statement to be true.
Exactly. And, there's a lot of debate within anti-realism about what the best theory of truth is.
Yeah, it's a rich and complex area of philosophy.
It is. And it's fascinating how these debates about truth connect to so many other philosophical issues.
Absolutely. Like we've seen how it connects to metaphysics, epistemology, language.
Yeah. And it also connects to ethics, aesthetics, political philosophy. Like, pretty much every area of philosophy has some stake in the debate about truth.
It's really at the heart of it all.
It is. And I think that's what makes it so exciting to think about. Okay, so we've talked about realism, we've talked about anti-realism. Is there anything else we need to cover?
Well, there are a couple of more recent views on truth that we should mention. One is truth pluralism.
Truth pluralism.
Yeah. This view says that there are multiple ways for something to be true. Like, there's no single account of truth that works for all kinds of statements.
Okay, so maybe correspondence works for some things, coherence works for others, and maybe there are even more ways to be true.
Exactly. And truth pluralists argue that this makes sense because different kinds of statements are doing different kinds of things.
So, like, a scientific statement is trying to describe the world, while a moral statement is trying to express a value judgment.
Right. And they might have different standards of truth.
Okay, so truth pluralism is kind of like saying that truth is a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. But it's not just saying that anything goes. Truth pluralists still think there are standards of truth. It's just that those standards might vary depending on the kind of statement we're dealing with.
Right. Okay, so that's truth pluralism. What's the other recent view?
The other one is deflationism.
Deflationism.
Yeah. This view says that basically truth is not as big a deal as we've been making it out to be.
Okay. So all this talk about correspondence, coherence, pragmatism, it's all a bit overblown.
According to the deflationists, yeah. They think that the word true is basically just a tool we use to express agreement or endorsement.
Okay, so like if I say, it's true that the sky is blue, I'm just saying that I agree with the statement, the sky is blue.
Right. And deflationists point to the Tarski biconditionals as evidence for their view.
Oh yeah, those S is true if and only if S statements.
Exactly. They say that those biconditionals show that there's nothing more to truth than just this kind of equivalence.
Okay, so truth is just a matter of like removing the quotation marks.
In a nutshell, yeah. And deflationists argue that this is a much simpler and more elegant view of truth than all those complicated theories we've been talking about.
Interesting. So deflationism is kind of like the opposite of truthmaker theory. Truthmaker theory says that truth is super metaphysically heavy, while deflationism says it's super metaphysically lightweight.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And both views have their proponents and their critics.
I guess that just shows how complex and multifaceted this whole concept of truth is.
Definitely. It's one of those philosophical concepts that just keeps giving. The more you think about it, the more questions you have.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good place to leave it for today. We've covered a lot of ground, but we've only scratched the surface of this vast and fascinating topic.
So, for our listeners who are intrigued by these ideas, I encourage you to dive deeper into the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on truth. There's so much more to explore there.
Yeah, and if you're really feeling ambitious, you can check out some of the work by the philosophers we've mentioned today. Moore, Russell, Tarski, Field, Davidson, Dummett, the list goes on and on.
It's a lifetime of philosophical exploration waiting to happen.
It really is. And on that note, we'll wrap things up for today. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.